Joe LeBlanc woke up in the apartment that he rented at Fox Hollow Farm to the sound of knocking. "Who's there?" he called, but no one answered. He stood warily and walked across the room. The knocking continued. It grew furious as he took his time moving across his apartment in the direction of the door. Joe had good reason to be reluctant to open his door that night. Things like this had happened before, more than once, and more than once he'd opened the door to find no one outside. Fred, his dog, started to growl. Joe, feeling like someone was trying to spook him, became frustrated. He stormed across the apartment, grabbed the handle of his door, and ripped it open. Not only was there no one outside knocking on Joe's door, the door handle was standing at a 90-degree angle, as if someone were there, holding it up. There was no one on the porch, no one receding down the stairs into the forest. Joe was standing alone. That night, as Joe prepared to go back to bed, he heard the doorknob being slowly turned. Suddenly, the door flew back on its hinges, and cold air blew leaves into the apartment, though moments before, the night had been calm. Behind him, Joe sensed movement, and when he turned, there was a man standing in his bedroom. The man's face was filled with terror. He took 3 steps and vanished into thin air. Joe would later describe him as a young man in his 20s, and he looked as if he were running for his life. This was not the first mysterious and unnerving experience that Joe LeBlanc had when he lived at Fox Hollow Farm. It would also not be the last. Welcome to Bitter Endings, a true crime podcast. I'm your host, J.R. Erickson. In Bitter Endings, I'll bring you stories of those taken too soon, the silent many who no longer have a voice through which to seek justice. The Bitter Endings podcast is sponsored by My Fiction Novels. The Northern Michigan Asylum series are novels that braid elements of haunting and murder mystery, and they're all inspired by a real former asylum here in Traverse City, Michigan, which is where I live. You can find the novels on Amazon.com in audio format if you are an Audible listener, as well as in ebook and paperback. This is part 2 of the podcast on the Fox Hollow Farm and Herb Baumeister. And part 1 was in last week's episode 9. And if you missed that episode, you will want to go back and listen to that before you listen to this one. The last episode covered the murders that happened at Fox Hollow Farm, as well as the murderer, Herb Baumeister. And this episode is about the hauntings that have happened at Fox Hollow Farm in the years since more than 11 bodies were discovered there. A lot of the information in this episode is taken from the book, The Horrors of Fox Hollow Farm, which is by Richard Estep and Robert Graves. And just a little bit of background, Robert Graves is the man who eventually purchased and moved into Fox Hollow Farm with his wife and children. He would be the first family, or his family would be the first family to live in the house after Herb Baumeister's family left it. In the spring of 2006, Robert and Vicki Graves started looking for a property in Indiana. They considered themselves horse people, and they wanted a ranch or a space with acreage where they could have their horses. They found a listing for a large 2-door style home that had 9 bathrooms, 4 bedrooms, an apartment, a library, and an indoor pool. It also had 2 horse stables and a 4,000 square foot garage. It was expensive. The owner was asking $2.8 million, which was actually quite below the market value for a house of that size. It had more than 18 acres. When they arrived at the house, they noticed that it had not been lived in for a long time. The house had begun to deteriorate. Paint was peeling. There was a musty smell when they walked inside. Raccoons had taken up residence in the attic. Some of the drywall on the upper floors was collapsing. Their realtor explained to them that the Fox Hollow farm was a stigmatized or psychologically impacted property due to the horrific crimes that Herb Baumeister had committed there. The current owner had never even lived in it, but had wound up with the estate as part of a real estate deal that had not worked out. Vicki and Rob were not deterred by the history of Fox Hollow Farm. It was an ideal property, and they managed to negotiate a price that worked for both themselves and the seller. However, they soon came to realize that things were not as they seemed at Fox Hollow Farm. One morning, as Vicki was vacuuming in the area where the swimming pool was located, the vacuum suddenly switched itself off. When she looked at the plug, she realized it had been pulled from the wall socket. She plugged it back in, and a moment later, it died again. She plugged it in a third time, and she could see that there was slack in the power cable. However, as she was gazing at it, the power cable flew out of the outlet with no one having touched it. She was looking at it as it happened. It scared her, and she had no explanation. She also noted that at the time this happened, she felt as if there were a presence in the room with her, someone who didn't want her there. Several months after Vicki and Rob and their children moved into Fox Hollow Farm, one of Rob's co-workers was looking for a place to live. His name was Joe LeBlanc. Rob told him that they had a spare apartment at Fox Hollow Farm and he'd be welcome to check it out. Joe came over, looked at the apartment, and decided that he liked it. When Rob told him about the history of Fox Hollow Farm, again, like Rob and Vicki, he was undeterred and he moved into the apartment. During Joe's first night staying in his new apartment at Fox Hollow Farm, he had a vivid and terrible dream. In his dream, he was running desperately through the woods, terrified as something dangerous pursued him. Joe woke up and leapt out of bed. He ran across the room and slammed his head into his door frame, which caused him to fall, and he lay there shocked. He said later he'd never had such an intense dream. Sometime after this happened, Vicki was outside talking to Rob about some of the painting he'd been doing on the house. She suddenly became distracted. In the woods to the side of the house, she noticed a young man. He was walking away from her in a bright red shirt and denim jeans. He looked like he was just taking an afternoon stroll through the woods. However, as she started to call out to him, she realized that from his thighs down, his legs simply were not there. As she watched, he vanished into the forest. Rob asked her what she was looking at, and she explained that she'd just seen someone walking through the trees, but they vanished into thin air. So keep in mind, when Rob hears this, he's thinking that it is a person who's trespassing on Fox Hollow Farm, because this is a place that is known as the house and the property where Herb Baumeister murdered his victim. So there are inevitably people who show up to take a look around. And he had already encountered some of these people, and they had more than once asked them to leave the property or contacted the police. So in this case, Rob is assuming that Vicki has just seen a trespasser, and he searches the woods. However, he found no evidence of any other person that was on the property. At the end of Joe's first week in his apartment, he was standing at his sink washing dishes when someone knocked on the door. He called, "I'll be right there," and the knocking got louder. His dog Fred started to growl. His hackles were raised. When Joe opened the door, he found no one outside, no one walking down the stairs, no one anywhere. Joe asked the Graves family if they'd come to visit him, and they said no, they hadn't been up there. He had started to feel uneasy. He had the sense that someone else was in the room watching him right after he opened the door and found no one outside. He felt that he and his dog were not alone. He sat down to watch TV and saw a flash of movement behind him near the kitchenette and bedroom. He searched the apartment, but it was empty. Due to the strange things that had started to happen at Fox Hollow Farm, and just the fact that they did periodically have intruders that were coming to look at the property of a former serial killer, Rob Graves decided to install a closed-circuit security camera to find out if there was anyone sneaking onto the property. But it turned out to be a dead end. He did not capture any video of intruders at Fox Hollow Farm. One evening after dinner, Joe took Fred for a stroll around the grounds, and apparently this was something he did regularly. He'd been there for about a month at this point, and as they walked, he heard something in the trees off to their left. He didn't really think much of it. They were in a forest after all, and there are a lot of nocturnal animals, raccoons and foxes and things that come out at night. As they walked, Fred suddenly stopped in his tracks. He stared into the woods at a particular spot with his ears perked, and he began to growl. A moment later, Fred sprinted into the trees. Joe went after his dog, and he saw the figure of a man in a bright red shirt with blue jeans who was walking away from him. However, Joe became very uneasy when, as he was staring at this figure, he realized that the person did not seem to have any legs from the thighs down. When he first spotted the man seemed totally solid, but after a moment, he vanished. Joe ended up chasing his dog further into the forest, and he encountered the man a second time. This time, the man in the red shirt was only 20 feet away from him, and he was standing still and watching Joe. Terrified, Joe turned around and ran. Eventually, Vicki and Joe talked about the strange things they'd seen at Fox Hollow Farm, and they realized that they'd both seen a man in a red shirt with a pair of blue jeans on who appeared not to have any legs below his thighs. Sometime after this, Joe told Vicki and Rob that he'd been walking in the woods when he found what he thought might be a bone. He brought the item wrapped in tissue paper into Rob. Rob had previously performed autopsies, and he was familiar with human anatomy. He said that it looked like a human bone. Rob contacted the forensic anthropologist who had worked on the Fox Hollow Farm case when they had first been excavating and discovering the bodies that Herb Baumeister had left there. Rob sent a photo of the bone to the anthropologist, but ultimately the man asked Rob to bring it into the lab. So Rob took it to the University of Indiana. The anthropologist looked at the bone and concluded that yes, it was human, and it was a human left femur. It had probably been on the farm for about 15 years, which was around the time that Herb Baumeister was disposing of his victims there. This was not the last bone that they would find at Fox Hollow Farm. Sometime after the bone was found, Joe would have the experience that I started the episode with, where he woke in the night to the sound of repeated knocking on his door. When he went to his door and opened it, there was no one there. And a few moments later, a wind that also had not been there seemed to blow the door open. When he turned to go back to bed, he saw a terrified man in his apartment, in the bedroom in particular, and the man seemed to be fleeing something. Joe would later mention how the look on this man's face really reminded him of the dream he'd had his very first night in Fox Hollow Farm, when he was running through the forest trying to escape some dangerous entity that was behind him. As these experiences continued to happen to Joe, so I've only listed a couple, but from what was described in the book, it became something of a regular experience for him, where he would hear sort of this insistent knocking on his door and no one would be there. He started to feel as if something or someone was toying with him or trying to scare him. As Joe and Vicki shared their strange experiences and talked also with Robert about these experiences, they decided to watch some of the old news coverage of the bodies found at Fox Hollow Farm. As they were watching, Joe suddenly stood up, and Robert described how his face went pale. Joe said, "That's him," pointing at the screen. "That was the guy who was in my room last night." They didn't disclose in the book what victim Joe was pointing to, but obviously this story highlights that Joe did believe that he was being haunted by one of Herb Baumeister's victims. Another uncanny experience that Joe would have happened in the pool at Fox Hollow Farm. One evening he was swimming in the interior pool with one of his friends, as well as the sons of Vicki and Robert Graves. While Joe was resting against the side of the pool, he suddenly felt fingers close around his neck. He said the hands were ice cold and they felt like a man's hands, not a child's. Joe spun around thinking it was his friend playing a prank, but he realized his friend, as well as the Graves boys, were at the opposite end of the pool. He began to swim into the center of the pool, and it happened a second time. Not only did he feel as if he was being strangled, but he felt that he was being pulled under the water. Joe climbed out of the pool and yelled at everyone else to get out. He said it was absolutely terrifying. Even later, when he spoke about the experience, it was very upsetting for him to relive it. He never swam in the pool at Fox Hollow Farm again. Sometimes there would be sort of lull periods between the strange occurrences. So after Joe had the scary experience in the pool, nothing out of sorts happened for a little while. And then one evening, he described hearing a scraping sound as he sat at his computer desk. When he looked in his kitchen, all of his knives had been removed from their block and laid out in the kitchen sink. He also noticed a series of gouges cut into the wall. He didn't know if they'd always been there or if they were new. Continuing to feel mystified and somewhat frustrated by the stuff that was happening at Fox Hollow Farm, and that on some level seemed to be targeted at him, he decided one evening to set up a voice recorder and see if he could capture any sounds from, a potential paranormal entity. In the book, book, this was described as an EVP, or an electronic voice phenomenon. And the idea is that a spirit, an entity, can somehow imprint themselves on a recording. And some people write these sounds off as random radio waves or background noise, but paranormal investigators often cite them as proof that there are other entities trying to communicate. So Joe turned the recorder on and he just started walking around his apartment asking questions. After a few minutes with nothing strange happening, he stopped the recording and played it back. When he asked aloud who was walking around his apartment late at night, he heard a male voice say, quote, "the married one." None of Herb's victims were married. Only Herb himself was married. So Joe started to believe that he was being haunted by Herb Baumeister. And it seems that other paranormal investigators have wondered about this as well, partially because Joe actually fit Herb's type. He was a young 20-something white male, and he was living in the house where Herb had committed all of these atrocious murders on these young men. In the book, The Horrors at Fox Hollow Farm, Robert Graves spoke about how the producers of the TV show Ghost Adventures reached out to himself and Vicki and inquired about shooting an episode at Fox Hollow Farm. They decided to go ahead and do it. They weren't necessarily sold on the idea of a paranormal television show, but they also felt like something was going on at Fox Hollow Farm, and they wanted people to come in and prove it or disprove it. Ghost Adventures follows several paranormal investigators who spend a few days at a space and try to gather evidence, either proving that it's haunted or it's not. It's often dramatic and over the top, but again, Rob and Vicki were curious and hoped maybe they'd get some answers. I watched part of the segment of Ghost Adventures that covered the Fox Hollow Farm, and honestly, I don't usually watch paranormal investigation shows. I'm interested in otherworldly things. I absolutely am, but I'm not into reality TV or the need to dramatize everything. And one of the challenges with these shows is there's an agenda. It's all about ratings and viewers and stimulating chemical reactions in people's brains so they stay riveted during the commercial breaks or whatever. So it's hard to trust the supposed findings in these cases. And I will say that's definitely true about this. I didn't even watch the entire episode. It felt a little bit contrived. Is it contrived? I have no idea. They stated that they were hearing things, that there were voices showing up on their recordings, and I'll talk a little bit more about what actually they discovered during the show, but I did find it to be a little too extreme. So from what I have experienced and the stories that I have heard from other real people about their paranormal experiences is that they're really subtle and they're kind of random and probably something we'll never understand until we are no longer in these lives. In the show, the group of investigators with Ghost Adventures show up at the Fox Hollow Farm. They meet Rob and Vicki, and they get a little bit of a tour of the house, and they find out some of the places where really terrible things happen. They mention that Vicki is a pathologist by trade, and that gives her some credibility, according to the show, in terms of her not necessarily being someone who is likely to believe in paranormal things. And whether or not that's true, I don't know. I think we definitely do have this idea that if someone is scientifically minded, that they are automatically more credible when it comes to supernatural experiences because they wouldn't normally believe in those things. Vicki ended up telling the investigators that there was one particular room that she had a very unsettling sensation there, and it was actually Herb Baumeister's bathroom. And it was also what seemed to me a little strange that one of the investigators, Zach, sort of focused on Robert Graves and compared him to Herb Baumeister himself, and sort of made a comment that Robert Graves had some mannerisms and similarities to Herb. I don't know exactly what the implication is. I guess maybe that if Herb's spirit was there, it had attached itself in some way to Rob. And Rob actually addressed this in the book, The Horrors at Fox Hollow Farm. And he said that, Zach made mention of this, but that he himself does not feel even remotely like Herb Baumeister's spirit has had any interaction with him. And also that overall, the paranormal experiences that had occurred had mostly happened to Joe LeBlanc or to Robert's wife, Vicki. As the Ghost Adventures episode went on, they looked in the pool room, and their focus was on the pool room because it is believed by law enforcement that Herb Baumeister kind of lured these gay men out of bars in Indianapolis back to his home with the promise of this pool, and they could go for a swim and have a drink, and then he likely strangled them in the pool and derived some kind of sexual pleasure from that, and then disposed of their bodies on his property. But again, since Herb killed himself, they really don't know exactly how he murdered these men or what occurred at Fox Hollow Farm. The investigators on the show also interviewed Joe LeBlanc. He had lived at Fox Hollow Farm for 2.5 years. And again, he was probably the person who had the most paranormal experiences. He showed them the large door with the metal horsehead knocker where his apartment was. He told them that he believed Herb was the spirit that was haunting him and that it was an aggressive spirit. He described the young man he saw in his bedroom one night running for his life. The Ghost Adventure guys also interviewed the private investigator who helped the police to capture Herb Baumeister. And he just described a little bit about how he got involved with the case, which started when 2 separate families of Herb's victims reached out because these young men had disappeared without a trace. And as he started to investigate, he realized that other young men who were very similar had disappeared from the same general area. One of the things that was talked about in the interview with the private investigator was how Herb killed himself. And the private investigator said that he had done this in a, quote, ritualistic way. And when the Ghost Adventure investigators asked him to explain what he meant by ritualistic, the man said that Herb had used some kind of raised sand to lay on, and there were dead birds spread out around him. I just want to mention that I did not find any newspaper articles, any information that described Herb as having done any ritual whatsoever when he killed himself. The information that I found was that he basically laid down on kind of in an isolated state park and shot himself. But again, is it speculation? Is it sort of creepy theories that people come up with after someone dies, especially if there are hauntings associated with the house? And of course, being a dramatized television show with paranormal investigations, the investigators kind of honed in on this mention of the ritualistic thing and asked the private investigator if they thought Herb had done this in order to return to his home as a spirit and haunt it. And the private investigator just said that's possible. During the Ghost Adventure show, the investigators used something called an SB7 spirit box in an attempt to talk with spirits. Apparently, this is an item used by paranormal enthusiasts to speak directly with spirits. Zach, one of the investigators, asked for the spirit to tell them their name. It seemed to say, "I'm dead." He then asked who killed him, and the spirit or the voice said, "I don't know." He also asked the question, "How many men did Herb kill in this house?" And the voice said Herb did it. And, again, watching the show, listening to this stuff, I'm not sold by this stuff. Other things that happened during the Ghost Adventure show, Zach also said that he felt a very heavy pressure on his chest at one point, and his heart rate started to speed up. There were more things that ended up happening in the show, and ultimately I didn't watch the entire thing because it's just not for me. So Robert Graves described that over the following years, after they had, the Ghost Adventure show filmed at Fox Hollow Farm, they had quite a few psychics and paranormal investigators who visited Fox Hollow, and many of them said that they sensed Herb Baumeister still lingered there, as well as some of his victims. Much of the paranormal activity apparently slowed down after Joe LeBlanc moved out, and again, he lived there for about 2.5 years. A shaman who visited Fox Hollow Farm told Rob and Vicki that there were several Native American spirits who'd been there for a long time and were angry with the way the land had been treated, although they were not connected to the murders. So the second half of the Horrors at Fox Hollow Farm really goes into Richard Estep's experience there. And Richard Estep contacted Robert Graves and explained to him that he was a paranormal investigator who lived in Colorado, and he was interested in flying to Indiana to spend a few days at Fox Hollow Farm and perform his own investigation. So a big portion of the book was dedicated to Estep's experience at Fox Hollow Farm. So just a quick bio on Richard Estep, and I took this directly from his website. He describes himself as an author, a paranormal investigator, and a D-list TV personality who has been on the Haunted Case Files, which is a paranormal investigation show in the UK, as well as Haunted Hospitals and Paranormal 911. He explained that his love of ghostly things started when he stayed as a young child at his grandparents' haunted home in England. He said that he didn't begin investigating hauntings until the mid-90s, but once he was involved, he became somewhat obsessed with it. And he moved to the United States in 1999 and eventually formed the Boulder County Paranormal Research Society in 2006, which is in Boulder, Colorado. So one of the things that Richard Estep says right at the beginning of his section in the Horrors at Fox Hollow Farm is that he's been to many, many places as a paranormal investigator, and none of them have affected him the way that Fox Hollow Farm did. He also mentioned that his intentions as a paranormal investigator are not to confirm that there are definitely ghosts, but also to potentially debunk the idea that there are ghosts and to see if there is some other natural cause for kind of the strange things that had happened. So he first visited Fox Hollow Farm in November of 2016 with a small group of investigators. He said that he felt immediately uneasy when they pulled up to Fox Hollow Farm, but As an aside, it was pouring down rain when he arrived that day, and he mentioned that he really didn't know if his unease was a natural reaction to the paranormal activity or the energy of the place, or if it had more to do with the fact that he'd read up on the case of Herb Baumeister, and so he was coming in sort of already biased and already with this very creepy history about Fox Hollow Farm. I'm not going to go extremely in-depth into the discoveries that Estep and his investigators made while they were there. If you're curious, you can read all about them in the book, The Horrors at Fox Hollow Farm. Estep took a variety of equipment to the house with him, which included recording devices, video cameras, a laser grid, and other things that they would use to try to pick up shadows, spirits, voices, etc. He visited Fox Hollow Farm more than once and experienced strange phenomenon each time he went there. He offered examples of people being touched, often on their backs, himself included. Investigators saw shadows moving in various places. At one point, they saw a shadow moving across the pool room. During his first visit, there was a single woman investigator with them, and she seemed to receive hostile pushes and other contact by unseen entities while in the house, and they wondered if perhaps that was the spirit of Herb Baumeister not liking that there was a woman in the pool area. Devices that were fully charged would be suddenly drained of their battery power, which Estep explained often happened in places where there was paranormal activity. At one point, Joe LeBlanc visited Fox Hollow Farm in an attempt to draw Herb's spirit out. Estep said they set up a K2 meter, which measures changes in electrical activity. As Joe called Herb a coward and demanded that he reveal himself, the meter started to record high levels of EMFs. In Estep's second visit to Fox Hollow Farm, the sound of footsteps were recorded on a recording device. One of the investigators saw a phantom white cat, which apparently had also been seen previously by Vicki Graves. A psychic named Brian also visited the property during one of the investigations, and he had previously met Rob and Vicki Graves and given them very accurate readings about deceased loved ones, and so they had requested that he be in attendance for some of Estep's investigation. And Brian ended up saying that he sensed that one of Herb Baumeister's victims had been murdered in the apartment that Joe LeBlanc had formerly lived in. Many women who were part of the investigations, including psychics, felt uneasy in Herb's former bathroom. And again, even Vicki Graves avoided the bathroom because she felt unwelcome inside of it. One psychic claimed that the bathroom was a portal, essentially stating that spirits could come through into the physical world through that space. And the psychic also claimed there was another space within the house that was also a portal. Estep also reported feeling a heaviness and a difficulty breathing when he was in the apartment that Joe LeBlanc had previously lived in. Despite the disturbing encounters that they'd had at Fox Hollow Farm, the Graves family continued to live there. Although the paranormal activity has seemed to slow down, they admit they still regularly have strange experiences. And I believe that to this day they are still occupying the house. I saw somewhere online that some of the acreage had been sold off or parceled off. That pretty well sums up the hauntings at Fox Hollow Farm. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. I apologize again that it is not only a week late, but also a week and a day late. I had intended to release it yesterday, and then my toddler got sick, and I was unable to do so. In any case, thanks so much for listening. If you want to find out more about the hauntings, I will link to the book, The Horrors at Fox Hollow Farms, in my show notes, and I will also put a link to the Ghost Adventure show that was recorded there. And if you do any basic online search about the hauntings at Fox Hollow Farm, you will get a lot of information, videos, and other material you can check out. Thanks again. If you have any comments or case suggestions, please send me an email at bitterendingspodcast@gmail.com. You can also find out all of the resources for this episode and read the show notes and more. Visit my website at www.bitterendingspod.com. You can also find me on Facebook at Bitter Endings Podcast. The Bitter Endings Podcast is sponsored by My Fiction Novels. The Northern Michigan Asylum series are novels that braid elements of haunting and murder mystery, and they're all inspired by a real former asylum here in Traverse City, Michigan, which is where I live. You can find the novels on Amazon.com in audio format if you are an Audible listener, as well as in ebook and paperback. If you enjoyed today's episode of Bitter Endings and you would like to hear more, please consider subscribing to this podcast and also leaving a review. Thanks so much and have an amazing and a safe day. I just want to take a quick minute to also acknowledge the music played in the Bitter Endings podcast. This song is called Disease Tree by Noya Sakamata.